Dear comrades and friends, red salute on the 134th May Day, this time amidst a pandemic that has engulfed big nations to the small nations through all the continents in the world. Literally, the world is reeling under the pandemic and the pressure of the economic crisis that was impending from 2008 onwards. Actually, it was third depression that was in the making from the beginning of this 21st century. Now this pandemic has become an acute overburden upon the crisis that was being expected as continuum of this third depression from 2018 onwards. From 2008 meltdown up to 2018, the world was being told by the imperialist proponents that the crisis is going to alleviate by way of a recovery. But 2008 meltdown did not recover in the full, so they said that it's a pale recovery. By 2018, almost all the institutions, including IMF and World Bank, predicted that there will be a crisis in 2020. Now in 2020, we are witnessing an added misery to the world proletariat and toiling masses in the name of COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic, which had broken out in China, had been fought tooth and nail by Chinese system, its leadership, its people, and had been subdued within months in the land of China. But as the virus has traveled through means of transport and other interactions to other continents and countries, especially when it entered the capitalist citadels in Europe and America, the system has failed in those countries to contain it. Now, a dance of death is in progress in Italy, in Spain, in France, in other countries of the European mainland and England, and it has come to United States with added intensity, where it has affected more than 855,000 people. That means in Indian terms it is 8.5 lakh people. It has caused 61,000 and more deaths in United States, whereas it comes to nearly more than 1/4 of the total death rate of over the world. 2 lakh people have perished all over the world, and nearly 2 million, 19 lakhs and above are affected world over. This pandemic has proven a litmus test to the incapacity of world imperialist capitalist structure to fight such miseries for the human world. And it has completely exposed that capitalist imperialist system is not willing to fight for the people against such natural calamities. Like Black Death in 14th century exposed the inadequacies and inhuman face of feudalism. Now, COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the inadequacies and inhuman nature of finance capitalism or imperialism. Great Lenin had taught us in the beginning of 20th century that the transformation that has happened to the monopoly capitalism that has merged with bank capital is a nasty one, and that it is the dying nature of monopoly capitalism that is causing war and miseries over all the globe. Lenin said that imperialism is war. Now the world over, by the third depression, working class is facing that kind of a misery. This pandemic is not like a war. It is true that the war had affected the frontline countries that had involved in it. But the pandemic is not like that. It has affected almost all the countries in the world, causing a lockdown and carpet unemployment and miseries at the same time. So we should examine how this lockdown due to the COVID pandemic has redoubled the miseries of third depression. We should examine why the third depression has occurred before that. When we come to that, we understand that depressions are a sequence of imperialist crisis. In short, it is the result or the fruit of general crisis of finance capitalism that began from the 19th century in 1873, and it marched through the years up to 1896. We know that the great struggle of the Chicago comrades and their martyrdom was between that period, in 1886 and up to 1896, the world over trade union movements, and in Europe, the social democratic movement developed into Second International. It was the Second International that proclaimed that May 1st has to be observed as the landmark where the working class fought for 8-hour work, 8-hour sleep, and 8-hour entertainment. That it declared to the bourgeoisie that it's not going to work for as it wanted. And it is not going to work for the ultimate benefit of the bourgeoisie alone. The men wanted to live like men in dignity and in peace and in amity. So they wanted to fight for the working day's limitation to 8 hours. And that was the beginning of the democratic right of the working class, or that was the beginning of the definition of working class about the democratic right. Like that, it marched on to the 20th century from 19th century with a new vigor and with a new aim. That was because of the recovery from the first depression that led to a world war. Unlike in the common understanding, a recovery from the depression, long depression, did not peace and amity among the world, because by the recovery, capitalism turned over into a new beast, that is finance capital or imperialism. By the closing years of 19th century, the monopoly capitalism that emerged through the competition of free capital, and when that monopoly capital found that credit system was inevitable, it merged with bank capital, which formed a new kind of beast, that is finance capital. This finance capital needed more places to get invested, and it wanted more places to plunder natural riches for the development of further amassment of finance capital. So that caused a war for colonies between England, France, and other former colonial forces on the one hand, and Germany and Turkey and Austria on the other hand. This war spread over to the eastern side of the Europe, and Russia also got involved. And now the working class movement was drawn into a bitter struggle between reaction and revolution. That was the point from where great Lenin taught us that the imperialism means war, imperialism means misery, and only remedy to imperialism is revolution. And the development of Soviet Russia was a new beginning. It proved and showed to the working class that there is a doorway of freedom from exploitation, that it can have a systemic emancipation from the capitalist system. That is what is scientific socialism. And from 1917 onwards, as Soviet Union began its voyage with the model that was not precedent in the history of the world, that the working class can hold on to power and exercise that power to build up a systemic alternative that can end exploitation of capital, that can end the capital itself in a distant future. So this made a new meaning to international working class movement. To the vanguard of the working class, it gave a science and tool to change the society. The total working class movement, it gave a positive, meaningful end of exploitation and a hope. So, by the beginning of a socialist construction in Soviet Union, world over, the working class movement in total got a new meaning and direction. But that did not, suo motu, happen to be a revolutionary end in the Western European capitalist countries and America. So, capitalist imperialist structure on the one hand and socialism on the other hand came into a bitter contradiction. And that contradiction became the central contradiction of the international events altogether. This developed into a new kind of a battle, a conscious battle for systemic change. The world over, even the last trade union or the last legion of the workers had a hope in the development of a socialist alternative. So, world over, imperialist forces and its lackeys, its most reactionary backward elements even, fought against the Red Banner, against the May Day, against 8-hour work, against union rights, against the association of working class, its rights of any kind. So this had added to the meaning in the 20th century. The struggle, the class struggle was entering into a new realm. This came to a phase, a new phase of generation of republics, generation of public wealth, generation of state infrastructure, generation of welfare, so on. So capitalism wanted to rearrange its mechanism. So under the leadership of United States, after the Second World War, it entered into a kind of welfare state institutions. But this was after Second World War. Before Second World War itself, a new kind of change happened to imperialist stage, that was fascism. We know that by the beginning of 20s, when Soviet Union began its voyage, a new development happened over all the world. So the capitalist imperialist structure wanted to fight against it, on the one hand. On the other, the capitalist countries themselves had a bitter struggle in between. It did not end by the First World War. It spilled over to a Second World War. In between the First World War and Second World War, because of this fetishistic battle between imperialist forces and because of the crisis that imperialism was adding on to it by way of additional exploitation and amassment of wealth, in 1929, Great Depression or Second Depression happened, and that Second Depression lasted over to the end of Second World War in 1945. So we understand that the history of a capitalist imperialist system had two great depressions. One is the long depression of 1873 to 1896, and the other is known to be the Great Depression or the Second Depression between 1929 to 1945. Again, here Lenin was correct that imperialism meant war and miseries. Imperialism meant the general crisis of the capitalist imperialist system. So the 1929 marked this new depression, that is second depression, with only one change. What was the change? In between that Great Depression or Second Depression, an area of the globe from that was Soviet Russia. And Soviet Russia was free from this Great Depression because it had a new magic wand, that was 5-year plan and planned economy. Under the proletarian dictatorship, under the rule of the working class, and it proved to be free from the miseries of Great Depression. When in United States people were queuing up for a pot full of gruel, and in Europe when people were getting bread from the Red Cross Society, that they were not able to get even the regular food for Christmas. In Soviet Union, working class was building a new nation where technicians were flying from America to Soviet Russia for job. Engineers and technicians were flying from United States to Russia for job in the first 5-year plan between 1928 to 1931. The first 5-year plan was completed within 4 years, and that was a saga of the working class. It set a model for the world to surpass the Great Depression. But bourgeoisie didn't learn any lesson. They fought over, and a kind of rabid branch of finance capital emerged in Germany, Italy, and Japan. That was fascism. We know the dangers of fascism that emanated from Italy and Germany and Japan. We know that it had been the most rabid branch of finance capital that has become fetishistic for acquisition of colonies. So the war that began for colonies by the beginning of First World War, the phenomena of war that began with the First World War continued over with the leadership of the fascistic bourgeoisie. This time it went on being appeased by the imperialist countries. Capitalism didn't learn anything from the First World War. It was completely crisis-stricken by the Great Depression. So, because of these two reasons, these two reasons of the rest of the residue of the First World War and the impending crisis that happened afterwards, the Second World War became more ferocious than the First World War. And there was another reason, that Soviet revolution didn't spread over to the Western European countries. So the world proletariat had to suffer, and it had to fight within the country against the reactionary forces, and it had to fight world over against the fascist forces. This was the result why WFD was made after the victory over fascism. We know how fascism could be overrun. It could be overrun on the one hand of the united strength of the world proletariat, on the other the conscious effort of its leadership, that is the socialist bloc, to build an anti-fascist united front. This was possible because of 3 5-year plans in Soviet Russia. From the first one from 1928 to 32, the second one from 1933 to 37, and the third one was from 38 to 42. In midst of the third 5-year plan, Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, but Soviet working class was ready with the heavy industrial development, the agricultural development, and the war machinery development to meet the Nazi marauding Wehrmacht. So this was the result of the proletarian movement that began from the ending years of 19th century up to the midst of the 20th century. After 20th century, what we see, from the midst of 20th century, as we had learned up to that, the bourgeoisie learned a lesson. So direct colonialism was abandoned after the victory over fascism, but they tried to fight sometimes directly and overtly or sometimes covertly in the colonies. We saw it in Korean War and Vietnam War and its moves in the Middle East and West Asia. Its attempt to overthrow the socialist Cuba. But the movement from the camp of the working class and the socialists were not coping up with the innovations that United States introduced into neo-colonialism. That is why there was a setback in socialist camp by the fall of Soviet Union in 1990. What was the reason and how things developed to it? It was because of the lack of consciousness, development of consciousness among working class. It was because of the lack of international unity of the working class and with the oppressed people that led to the events of 1990, the fall of Soviet Union and East European socialist countries on the one hand. On the other, it was because of the reorganization of finance capital institutions by imperialist capitalist structure. But we should understand that imperialist capitalist system is not omnipotent or omniscient. It adjusted with the socialist onslaught. That is all. And what happened afterwards? Did the IMF, World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade that was established in Bretton Woods by the closure of Second World War succeed in making the imperialist system crisis free? No. Did John Maynard Keynes, who had been the architect of welfare statism, succeed in alleviating the crisis in the capitalist countries or in the colonies either? No. That was only a temporary rainbow of 30 years. From 46 up to, we see from 45 up to 75 we may calculate, but not even up to 75. On 73, there came the oil shock and by the closing years of 60s. So we can count up to 20-25 years of capitalist bonanza after the Second World War because of the long contracts that United States got from Europe and because of the void created by the dwarfing of Britain and because of the immense wealth that was amassed through the war contracts and oil wells by the United States. So this was the situation. This edge was only helping it for 25 years. Afterwards, when United States and capitalist countries began to fall into a stagnation, and later in 80s it became stagflation, they resorted to rabid methods of capitalism, that is neoclassicalism. And we know that as Soviet Russia was not able to cope up with this because of revisionist tendencies that has crept into Soviet bloc, and when Soviet Union fell, the situation became very easy for the imperialist capitalist system to run a marauding machine of a neoclassical economy upon the former colonies. That is what happened from 1991 onwards in India. Now what we see, because of this neoclassical economic introduction and socialist setback due to the fall of Soviet Union and the communalization in India because of the demolition of Babri Masjid, an era of negative tide began in India. That is what we see from 1991 onwards in both Congress regime and afterwards in recurring regimes of communal fascist forces led by RSS and BJP. Whenever they came into power, RSS and BJP combined, unleashed open disinvestment of public sector and complete bombardment of Indian public sector and the infrastructure that was built by the working class in the century after freedom. So what we see is in complete resonance with the imperialist capital behavior in America and Britain after the 80s, because of the general crisis that had developed through decades. And additionally, it had been because of the long live the international unity of the proletariat. Long live the international unity with oppressed people. Long live Worker Peasant Alliance. Down with imperialism. Down with capitalism. Long live socialism. Down with communal fascism and imperialist globalization. Long live socialism and socialist democracy.